It is every police leader's responsibility to not only continually develop their own skills and abilities, but to prepare the next generation of leaders. Retired Captain William Frost helps you meet this task by providing a clear blueprint to follow in his book, Leadership in Law Enforcement. To learn more about his book and other consulting and training he provides, go to www.code33consulting.com. That's code33consulting.com.
I'll call it the why generation, right? Like they want to know the why, whereas 18 years ago is, well, you're going to do it because I told you to. Versus I've always been a why person. I want to know why I'm being told to do something so I can better understand, for lack of better terms, like commander's intent, right?
Yeah.
And so I've always kind of questioned that for good or for bad. It's sat well with some people I work for. It's not sat well with some people I've worked for.
There's a lot of things that are either held close to the vest. Like, I'm not going to say that because it's going to be too reactive. Well, shoot, then why are you even doing it? Because if you want to be the best, the safest, the most efficient, effective, whatever, plug it in, then you need to put that on the table.
There is no leadership training per se, right? Like we can send guys to leadership training, quote unquote, but that's not, in my mind, that's not leadership training.
Welcome to Blue Grit Radio, the podcast that explores making better cops for a better community. I'm your host, Eric Tung. I've been an active police officer since 2007. We will dive into the aspects of police culture, health and wellness, leadership, and mindset. You'll hear from experts not only from policing, but all industries as they relate to being our best with purpose, passion, and positivity. Join me as we share stories, lessons, and advice so we can all be better for ourselves, our teams, our families, and our communities. All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to another episode of Blue Grit Radio. This is your host, Eric, and today I'm joined by a fellow Eric, someone that I've known for years, and this project's been going for a couple of years, but since the beginning, people were like, dude, you need to have Gordon on. Why don't you have Gordon on yet? So I think that speaks so much to your leadership and a lot of that positivity and constructive nature that you bring into the profession. So without further ado, Eric Gordon, thanks for coming on the show, man.
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. So getting a little teaser, but I've known you from agency next door for years, but just wanted to give you an opportunity to introduce yourself and tell the listeners a little bit about you and what brought you into law enforcement. What brought you into this this call to service?
Oh boy. So I guess I got to back up a little bit. So prior to being a police officer, I was in the military. Obviously, it was during the height of the GWAT, so things were very busy. I was never home, had a brand new son at home. Came back from my second deployment, and my son didn't know who I was and wouldn't let me hold him, and didn't really know who his dad was anymore, so that kind of hit hard. Had always kind of anticipated spending my entire life in the military. My dad was in the military, my grandpa was in the military, and so on and so forth. So I never really envisioned a life outside of that, but I knew that I didn't want what was currently going on with my kid to continue, because I had my whole military career mapped out in my head as to what I ideally would want to do. But I was sitting watching, funny enough, Cops. I love the show Cops when I was in the military.
It worked.
It did, man. And my wife asked me, like, hey, like, what do you want to do? And if you're not going to be in the military anymore, and I'm like, I don't know. It's like, this looks pretty fun. And so I pursued a career in law enforcement based on a TV show. And I mean, I guess, if I back up a little bit further than that, like I'd always kind of thought about, like, federal law enforcement and stuff like that prior to joining the military or post-military career. But I never really given much thought to local law enforcement. But I saw, again, the TV show, and I saw what they're doing. It looked fun. It looked exciting. Had a few friends that were police officers. And so it just kind of drew me towards that, and started the application process and never looked back.
Yeah. Did you ever have this itching to check out the feds and what they had going on? I mean, through the years, we end up working quite a bit with them. We get a better view into it.
I did. And so at the time when I was in the Ranger Regiment, we had FBI HRT folks that worked with us on deployments. And so I got to know some of them fairly well. They had just started a program called the Tactical Recruiting Program. And so it was basically a pipeline into HRT within the FBI. But it wasn't it's not a guaranteed spot, but it's an opportunity to try out to go to selection.
Okay.
And so about midway through the academy, I started, we can talk about the academy later, but there was things that I wasn't really enjoying about the academy. And so I applied with the FBI while I was in the academy. Um, Actually went to New York for an interview during the academy, passed
Oh
the
wow.
oral board there,
No
and
way.
then proceeded on to the oral board they had separately for the TRP program. Did well in that interview, had an academy date set up, and again, my wife came to me and said, "Hey, you realize like what you're doing is the exact same as what you just currently
Mm,
left." And so, I
mm-hmm.
mean, it's a very high tempo unit. They were currently deploying at the time overseas with JSOC and SOCOM units. And so it made me realize that I was, trading one thing for another that was almost identical. And so I just made the decision at that point just to pull the plug completely on it and walk away from it and stick with local law enforcement. Hindsight being what it is, I think it's a pretty solid decision. I'm
Yeah.
super happy with local law enforcement. I mean, you've done it your entire career too.
Yeah.
It it opens a lot of doors for a lot of freedom you don't have with federal agencies as far as where you're living, the hours you work, when you can take time off, all the reasons why I was getting out of the military. Um, it lended itself to a better lifestyle for my family.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
yeah.
No, it's solid. You don't know what you don't know. I thought
Hmm.
the Fed sounded awesome and prestigious and selective. And I'm not saying it's not, but I am saying that once I got into local, I'm like, man, this is the place to be for me. Um, I even remember relatively recently, I mean, we're talking about 2020, 2021, when things got real bad for all law enforcement. But one of our colleagues in the feds, and I won't say what agency, but he was talking about how how understaffed they were, how much overtime they're pulling, but there's no budget for overtime, and not just like, oh, you just go into the red like we do. I mean, they're always going to pay you. They just weren't getting paid for the extra hours, but they had a job they had to do, which I'm like, oh man, that's like, can't really relate to that.
Well, they do. So they do get overtime, but it's in the leap. And so like they count for that in their pay. And that's kind of
Hmm.
one of their recruiting things is, well, you get 25% this leap pay for overtime. Well, they get that 25% and then some.
Gotcha. Gotcha. So I hear this like, I mean, there's this high drive sense I've always gotten about you, and you've kind of alluded to that with your regard to being in a Ranger battalion and some of these other ventures that you're looking at. Has that always been a thing with you coming up, growing up?
No, it hasn't. So I guess we go back again in time. In high school, I had a contract to go into the Navy. Funny enough to be a BUDS contract.
Mm,
Always wanted to be a SEAL, right? Grew up watching the movies and all those things. I mean, SEALs do a fantastic job of recruiting, and
yeah.
ended up tearing my ACL my senior year in high school. And so the recruiter said, "Well, you got to wait to get a medical waiver a year to show the knee's solid and everything else." So I kind of ended up going to college by default. I ended up going to Central Washington University and doing what the typical college kids do. I drank my way out of college. So I ended up working in a gym in Ellensburg, and an ROTC recruiter came in. He ended up, him and I are still very close. Former Delta Force guy, grew up in the Ranger Regiment. Said, "Hey, have you ever thought about, joining the Army?" I said, "Why can't I got a bum knee?" And he's like, "Well, we could probably get you a medical waiver for that."
Mm,
I said, "The other caveat is that, I'm not currently enrolled in college. I got kicked out for drinking." And so he said, "Well, if I could get you back into college, would you consider doing the ROTC route?" I said, "Sure." So he got me back in. I had to go to his house every night and do homework, and he kept me on track. So my grades went from being in the garbage to being very, very good by the time I graduated college. But it was kind of him that was instrumental in my life, just to show like he grew up dirt poor. He grew up in a small town that had a gas station and a convenience store. His
mm,
mom worked in the gas station. His dad worked in a convenience store. His dad was a drunk, used to beat on him. Had a very poor education, and he went from nothing to, I mean, he's a super successful guy now.
yeah.
Started multiple companies that are very, 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 very profitable. Sorry, my dog's barking. But yeah, so it was kind of him that kind of instilled that in me, the work ethic and the drive, and to show that like, hard work pays off. And so through that process, I got into the military. He said, I can't guarantee you a spot in the Ranger Regiment. What I can do is I can guarantee you that if you work hard, that people will start to notice. And so I became that thorn in the side of the Ranger Regiment. It's a little different process. I went in as an officer, and so the process to get into the selection for Ranger Regiment is very selective. There's essentially 4,000 infantry lieutenants that are commissioned every year. There's 27 spots at the time in the Ranger Regiment for first lieutenants. So you go from 4,000 to 27. It becomes very selective. I intentionally chose Fort Benning as my duty assignment because I wanted to be close to regimental headquarters. And so I just began calling every Monday when I became eligible. Just eventually I think got tired of hearing from me and gave me an opportunity. They called me and said, "Hey, we have a spot that opens up on Monday." This was like on a Wednesday. If you want to go, it's yours. And so I quickly hustled, got my stuff together, and showed up for selection. By the grace of God, I made it through. It's a little bit different there. I didn't have the pedigree that most had. I came from a state college, not a military institute like West Point, and my dad wasn't a general. I didn't know anybody famous. I didn't know any congressmen, but I went there. I didn't have any combat experience. Everybody else has shown up, had all of the above, but I didn't quit, and I think that showed a lot. And at the end of it, I got selected, and kind of the rest is history. But
Nice.
to answer your question, no, like I think once I got the taste of like feeling rewarded for hard work, like it made me want to work harder. And then from that, I don't know, I have this thing now where I want to continually learn and expand. I want to travel and see different things and experience different cultures. And I never really had that. So like, I don't know where it came from, but it's kind of lit a fire in me.
Yeah. I love that. And that's a lot of the sense I get from you. And I think that, we'll talk more specifically about leadership, but you've been highly successful in a lot of things and assignments and being a TL for SWAT and like that all carries with it a lot of prestige and recognition within our law enforcement community. But beyond that, people really resonate with your character and how you make them feel in relationship. And so I think like when you think about being a true leader, that's what stands out to me. And that's why I was excited when you agreed to come on. And I wonder how much of that is like literally that mentorship and that maybe you could even call it sponsorship of that recruiter that literally had him in your house to hold account. And that's so much of leadership as well, right? Holding accountability to help people recognize what's possible within themselves when they may not even recognize it.
The military, love it or hate it, I think does a lot of things right. And that is the culture within the military. So you can only spend, a finite amount of time at each rank.
Mm-hmm.
If you're doing things right, minus getting in trouble and, getting arrested or whatever else that kind of puts you back a bit. But they kind of force leadership on you from a young age. I mean, even if you look at the enlisted track, right, you come in as a private, eventually you become a specialist and you become a sergeant. And so they're prepping you for these future leadership roles. And so the mantra is that you're constantly training your replacement. And so like that coaching and mentorship process, I think the military really has that dialed in because they call it the big green machine, right? Like as much as you want to stay there forever, like eventually you're going to become too old, too broke to continue to do that. So it's your job to train your replacement.
Mm-hmm.
And then going into the Ranger Regiment at the time, I mean, it was such a high tempo unit with the GWAT going on. I mean, they're deploying multiple times a year, and there wasn't a whole lot of time for people to be lackadaisical. And so you're in a 3-time volunteer unit. So you're volunteer to be in the military, volunteer to be airborne qualified, and you volunteer for the Ranger Regiment. So anybody there can leave at any point voluntarily. They can say, this isn't for me anymore. And then they can leave and go to a different conventional unit. And so you see these young 18, 19-year-old kids that come in and they continually work and work and work to improve because they don't want to be removed from that. And they don't want to let their counterparts down.
Mm-hmm.
And so like the whole team concept for me was kind of hammered home there, is that everybody there really is ensuring the success of everybody around them. It wasn't about, hey, look at me. It was, I want to make sure the team is successful because that's the most important thing. And so I think that's really where a lot of it for me kind of came full circle. Is, again, I showed up there. I didn't have the experience that other people had. The guy that I happened to be replacing for the job I was taking, he was a former enlisted guy. He was a Delta Force operator for a number of years before he went green to gold and became a lieutenant. So I'm huge shoes to fill, right? And here I am with no combat experience, very minimal time in the military. But again, my NCOs that I worked with, they put their arms around me and they say, hey, we're going to make sure that you're successful and we're going to make sure that you're properly trained. And so to me, that was like, oh, like they care about my success. I should probably start to learn about how they do the leadership thing here.
Yeah. Yeah, I love that. And I think that there's a there's that note from the military that I think we need to be really aggressive about adopting in law enforcement, right? So we talked about like the hard years, right? 2020, 21. Well, we had so much attrition that now we are experiencing, and I know so many agencies are experiencing this like experiential gap, right? So a lot of people that may have been very promising developing leaders like exited out of the career earlier than they expected, earlier than they planned. And so rather than throw our hands up and be like, shoot, like, what do we do? I think that we need to adopt that forced, almost like a forced like acceleration and pace of mentorship and giving people the baton to be like, hey man, like you're running this call. Hey, you're the officer in charge. You may or may not be testing for sergeant, and your sergeant's going to be there, kind of like a parrot, like a field trainer, right? To be like, hey, like, what are you thinking about now? What questions do you have? What are your thoughts on that?
I just had this conversation last week with some of our administrators that, I mean, as you know, I know your department's the same as mine in the sense that there is no leadership training per
Hmm.
se, right? Like we can
Yeah.
send guys to leadership training, quote unquote, but that's
Hmm.
not, in my mind, that's not leadership training. And so when you become a sergeant, for example, there is no FTO process to be a sergeant, right? There isn't. It's just, hey, congrats, Eric, like you're a sergeant now, and now you
Hmm.
should know how to do this job. And then you become a commander, same exact thing, right? You just expected to know how to do it. Well, in our line of work, as you know, things change rapidly. And so what may have worked 5 years ago isn't working today.
Yeah.
And how you connect with newer officers now is not how you would have 18 years ago, right? When I first started, it was you're brand new, sit in the corner, shut up and color. Versus
Hmm.
now, like it's awesome to see the coaching and mentorship that's occurring, and you're seeing these younger kids that are getting more opportunities early on, and you have the old people that are like, well, why they've only been a cop for 3 years, how could they possibly be a firearms instructor, how could they be an evoc instructor? Well, I think it's cool to see that you're giving these people responsibility. And again, military, you see a lot of responsibility given to young kids early on, and they either foster in there or they struggle, right? But it's your job to train them. And so with like the way we are now, it's really, really cool to see that there is that process. And so I think the same needs to occur for formal leadership positions within law enforcement, of that coaching and mentorship process. And maybe during your first year as a sergeant or commander, you have a coach or a mentor that you can go to with questions, and almost like an FTO process.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that there is that in some ways they expect you to not know it all, but they also expect you to know enough, right? And that's for most people that are adept and know to access the resources, that works fine. But are we in the business of working fine or working optimally, right? Like there's so
Yeah.
much risk and there's so many contingencies that I think having that, we can't rely on essentially our boss being our mentor, because sometimes they are, sometimes they aren't, sometimes they're not a great fit. And
Yep.
that's just kind of what pops into mind when we talk about whether these things are officialized or institutionalized or not.
Well, I mean, it's kind of twofold, right? Like you can learn as much from a bad leader as you can from a good leader.
Yeah.
And then the second part of that is we have this little pesky thing in our line of work called vicarious liability, right? Where based on your position, you should have known better. And so I think there needs to be that self-education piece too, is that you can't just assume that because you're in this position that you're done learning. You have to continue to dive into things and stay current on case law and policies, procedures, best practices, because those are the things that will really bite you in the butt as a supervisor.
Yeah, absolutely. So you talk about like meeting, let's say, let's call them the younger generation or the newer generation of cops, like meeting them halfway or maybe adapting leadership style to what you and I didn't experience coming in, right? It was literally just like keep your mouth shut, don't ask questions. And of course, we can think about how that breeds into issues if you can't go to your, official bosses to ask questions to learn. But regardless, like what do you think the resistance is? Because we are in this point where uh a lot of great leaders don't have that traditional view, but we still have enough of it in the culture where even, you bring up the military, and I think we take a lot of notes from the military, but we don't seem to be doing it in that regard for the police industry.
I think we're kind of in the, I'll call it the why generation, right? Like they want to know the why, whereas 18 years ago is, well, you're going to do it because I told you to,
Hmm.
because I'm your boss and that's the way it's going to be. Versus I've always been a why person. I want to know why I'm being told to do something so I can better understand, for lack of better terms, like commander's intent, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And so I've always kind of questioned that for good or for bad. It's sat well with some people I work for. It's not sat well with some people I've worked for.
Yeah.
But I like to explain the why versus just because I told you to. And I don't know, for me, like I encourage the folks that work for me currently to question me and hold me accountable, and I hold them accountable. And I think that's what really builds a good team is the freedom to ask why and for expansion onto why I'm being told to do something. And then the like, hey Eric, I can hold you accountable as my boss as well as you hold me accountable, because it's we should all be looking at the team concept, not necessarily trying to make ourselves look good. And I think that's where traditional law enforcement leadership is failed, is that people want to look good in the leadership positions they're in, but not understanding that if you just do right by the folks that work for you, like leadership's pretty simple. Like if you treat them well, give them the right things to do their jobs, like they do a pretty good job of taking care of you, which ultimately makes the team look good.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's really well said. And it's kind of an ironic thing where I find that a lot of officers and sergeants that are of the older generation tend to be asking why more. They might not recognize it or even admit to it that, they may even kind of highlight the younger generations of needing to know why. But I think we always wanted to know why. I mean, shoot, it's like tells old as time. Like anyone could tell someone to do something, whether it's parenting or whether it's your boss. Everyone's curious and they either want to know why so they can decide if they're on board or not. But really, if we go to that, like that's building trust and that's building alignment. And you talk about team a lot, and I love that. And I think that the only time that someone would be threatened by that as a boss is if there isn't trust, right? There isn't that relationship where, hey, someone's asking why. Well, they're not telling me I'm a POS and I have dumb ideas. They're literally asking a very simple question. It's one word, it's 3 letters, right? But am I going to go to a place where like, oh shoot, they're questioning me, they're questioning my authority and this and that? Like, I mean, that's up to me if I go to that place. But if we work on relationship and actually communicate in a healthy way, then that should be very avoidable.
Yeah, and I also think that where you see that, I don't want to say lack of confidence in leadership, it's where they feel like because based on their position or title that they should have all the answers. And that's not the reality of life. I mean, been doing the SWAT thing for a long time, and there's stuff that comes up all the time that I don't know the answers to. And I am constantly asking people around me, like, what am I missing? Because again, is the strength of the team, not the strength of me as a leader. But I think a lot of law enforcement leadership, they feel like they need to know all the answers. And so what you in turn get is a non-confident leader that is micromanaging because they feel like they have to have control over everything. And it's out of fear of not knowing. But again, man, it's the strength of the team. And so every op order I write currently gets sent to every other team leader in ATL. What am I missing?
Mm.
I bring everybody, from the newest person along with me, help show them the process. I'm training them to replace me because they're going to see things from a different perspective than I will being brand new. And so when they're asking those questions for me, I should find a way to have an answer to those. And if I don't know, then I'll try to find that answer for them.
Yeah. I like that. Even the simple share out to your shared team, right? Other team leaders and ATLs, like you're inviting them to come aboard and it builds buy-in, but it also is that training element, right? It's that mentorship and that building your ATLs to be part of the conversation because you map this whole thing out, then you bring them into the circle being like, hey, pick it apart. And now at one day, they're going to be a TL and they're going to have that experience and they're going to be building up their ATLs and so on and so on. So I like that tangible example. I think that for so many people, it's just recognizing, like you said it earlier, leadership is not extremely complicated. The nuances and personalities and programs that can get in the weeds for sure. But like at the base core, I think it's better when you don't try to act like you know everything. Like I find myself and I try to not be hesitant to say, I have no idea, guys. Like, when was the last time I did a DUI? Shoot, I was in K9, so I wasn't doing. I would write the paper or write the blood warrant, which I only did like a couple times ever. I was never like transporting them and processing them because of my role. And then I promoted to sergeant, and I didn't do it then. I didn't do it in recruiting, and on, right? So like,
Yeah.
how much does it really? I suppose. How much does it hinder trust if I try to act like the end all be all? Oh, because I'm a commander, I should know about DUI arrests. Like, no, I actually, the opposite of that. I'm not doing them at all. So you tell me what you need. You tell me the hurdles you're running into. and it's my job to try to facilitate like a better way or the right systems or the right resources for you to do it.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, like with my current group, I mean, we're leaning a lot on your guys' group currently to learn from them, but I have
Mm,
people within my group that have become very good at things that I know very little about. Like I know what they are conceptually, but how to complete them, I don't. And so like if my boss asks me, hey, what is going on with X, Y, and Z or this certain case, I'll refer them to the officer that's doing that because they're the experts, not me. And so I think, I don't have to pretend that I know something. I'll turn it over to the person that does for the explanation. And so I think when I do that, it allows that officer to feel more ownership of said skill or said case, and it gives them a sense of pride that their boss thinks very highly of them. And so if much like you probably have to give presentations to the city council, public safety board, and all that stuff, right? And so I'll bring those people with me and have them present the information to those folks because they're the experts, not me. I
mhm.
mean, I can manage the pieces and I can move the big pieces around, but if you ask me to write up, an area search warrant for cell phone information, I don't know how to do that. I know what it is. I know conceptually how to
Yeah.
apply that to the investigation piece, but I have folks that work for me that are far more experienced in that than I am.
Yeah. I want to talk about leading up, and I think that it's a very relevant conversation for a lot of listeners. A lot of the target audience is the up and coming leaders, but I'm pleasantly surprised when people mid career and on are listening in and they have their own tangible insights and feedback. But I think that's something that everyone can relate to. I mean, shoot, you could be top dog, you could be the sheriff or the chief, and you got to lead up to some regard because everyone's got a boss. But I'm curious what some of your thoughts are on that, and maybe where you learned those lessons or how you keep building on that.
Again, I think it just goes back to the team concept, right? Um, Picking your boss up when they're not strong in a certain area or they're unfamiliar about certain things. So I don't necessarily have I ever really called it leading up. I mean, I've read the concepts and books and whatnot about the whole concept of leading up. But for me, it's just picking up a teammate, and your boss is part of that team. Like it, love it, or hate it, they are. And so we're all part of the same organization. And so if you're seeing that they're lacking an area, you can help them with that, pick them up, right? And it's not about showboating, it's just about picking up your teammate. And so, I mean, it can occur from everything from assistance with, writing of a policy or writing of an SOP or a TTP or whatever the case may be, or just simple fact that they've got to give a presentation on information they may not be very good on, right? I had a boss last year asked me for input on an active shooter, presentation he had to give to a corporation within our city. And so that I guess that is a form of leading up, right? Like I'm helping my boss with a presentation, but at the same time, I appreciate that my boss saw that he was potentially, lacking in that area, needed information, and that I could provide for that. So it again gave me a sense of ownership. It helped me lead up. It helped him. So it helped the team at the end of it, right?
Yeah, I like that example, and it's like it's right in line with what you just said when you were giving that presentation to council, and you're bringing people in that were closer, like boots on the ground, doing the actual thing. You're like, well, shoot, I could like paraphrase it and probably not have all the extent of information, maybe not be able to answer all the specific questions, whereas I can bring in the actual expert to be alongside me. And there is
Mm-hmm.
mentorship in that too, right? There's that experiential thing where maybe that officer, detective, or operator would not have been in a council meeting for years and years and years or until a different role unless someone had invited them in. And so it's like not to defer work, but it's to enhance the product is kind of what I'm seeing and hearing.
100%. Yep.
I'm curious about some of your reflections. Like you've been on the team a long time, and I've done it numerous times on the show, but really given a lot of shout outs and praise to Valley SWAT. Uh, from working in different capacities around Valley SWAT, from being a canine handler to being a supervisor where you come in and work in the city and things like that. And I've always observed this very healthy team culture and this, I suppose, high accountability. And I'm curious of some of your thoughts on why that is, and maybe what I'm trying to get is for people to hear that and think about how they can adopt it for their own team, their own unit or squad, and go on from there.
So Valley SWAT itself is very unique in the sense that we're a multi-jurisdictional team, but it feels like one team. It doesn't feel like seven cities. So I've had the opportunity to teach, around the country SWAT stuff, and I've been teaching for the state for a number of years now. And I get a chance to see it twice a year at a minimum when I'm teaching the SWAT basic classes. And Valley SWAT's unique in the sense it does feel like one team. And I don't know why that is. Maybe it's just the culture. Maybe it's the op tempo, how busy we are, how often we see each other, there is that closeness there. But we also do a very, very good job of holding each other accountable. And so I know you've sat in some of those debriefs where they can get pretty harsh. And I think one thing that is taught very early on in the team is you have to be able to separate personal feelings from professional feelings. And so they're two completely different things. And the consequences are too high to let personalities and personal feelings get involved. So I may like Eric as a person, right? But you did something that was a safety violation that needs to be addressed. We can talk about that professionally, and the personal feelings get set aside. At the end of the day, when that's done, it's done, and we're back to being friends. But when I teach, I always say, well, if the SWAT team can't resolve it, who would you call? Right? And so if we respond to something and we're not trained or properly equipped to resolve that call, who else are you going to call? That there isn't anybody else. So maybe a better team, right? Like you could ask for a different team to come in and resolve that. But again, like unfortunately, I mean, SWAT teams are the last line of defense in law enforcement to resolve high stress or high liability, low frequency calls, right? And so I think if you just kind of keep that in the back of your head, that you have to maximize every training opportunity, every lesson learned, every debrief has to be open, honest, and professional. So that way we can identify either training deficiencies or equipment deficiencies that we can resolve going forward to make it safer. You have to kind of set aside those personal feelings. And so that is the one thing I've always liked about Valley SWAT is that like there isn't rank. There's just positions, right? Everybody is a team member. That it includes commanders, right? Everybody is equally able to give input and take criticism, and is all for the betterment of the team. And so it's pretty unique in the sense that that's the way it is, because as we know in law enforcement, people's feelings can get hurt pretty quickly, and then those feelings will affect everything else for a number of years to come, right? If they ever get resolved.
Yeah.
And so it's said, it's done, and we move on the team, and it's always for the betterment of the team.
Yeah, I can see that, and I like that you highlight that. I suppose it's accountability, but what I hear and what I'm comparing it to is there's a lot of teams that are very high paced, but they don't have that sense of team, and they don't have that trust to do a debrief in this really open, honest way. There's a lot of things that are either held close to the vest. Like, I'm not going to say that because it's going to be too reactive. Well, shoot, then why are you even doing it? Because if you want to be the best, the safest, the most efficient, effective, whatever, plug it in, then you need to put that on the table. I was talking to a colleague recently a few times about this, but we can observe tape, right? Quote unquote tape, but OIS, critical incidents from OSA across the nation, and people can pick it apart, every little thing, right? Because it's not personal. But if we venture to, I suppose, imagine doing our own agency or even our own squads, I think it depends on the squad, but I think most people would be extremely averse to entertaining that, or even the agency next door, because people know people. They're like, dude, you're going to call out this, they're a super squared away officer. Cool, that's not the point. And maybe it's a setting of expectations that gets you to that point of trust where, hey, we're not, I like how you said it, right? This is not a personal thing, this is a professional thing. But we have to establish that so everyone knows the ground rules.
Yeah, I think the OIS stuff specifically, if you kind of start to wade into some deeper waters, unfortunately, with the state of law enforcement in Washington State currently, right, is if you start to really get a critical eye on those things and it becomes public or written down somewhere, then you run the risk of that person potentially for civil litigation or criminal litigation down the road, right, based on opinions. I think that watching videos of OISs, you can glean a lot from them, but you also have to understand that those things happen in fractions of a second. And so yes, I think we should absolutely be looking at those things from a critical eye to get better and be safer. But it's really hard to place yourself in that person's shoes and see what they were seeing, smelling, feeling at that moment that caused that reaction. But yeah, I totally understand what you're saying, that it's kind of a double-edged sword when you come down to these debriefs. It can either sit well or don't sit well at the end of the day, but we should always be looking at how we can improve and be safer and make the culture better.
Yeah. No, those are really valid points. One is like you don't want to document like a misstep or quote unquote non-ideal circumstance that becomes ammo for the litigation later, right? And so that is
Mhm.
I think that is one thing that holds us back organizationally or industry wide, where you'd have the intent to get better, but man, if you put it on paper, you're asking for it. And the other note you made about OIS, I think, is so valid. I've said this numerous times and have reflected that in my own OIS, there was a part of me that really wanted to see the surveillance video that was like, on this trailer right at the side of our thing. But I already have these kind of fragmented, disjointed memories and recollection. That was basically me, getting disoriented in the fire and like walking around. I remember walking around this big circle until I would realize like, hey, this might not be over yet. But I was kind of intrigued and also terrified of what the video might look like because I didn't want to be embarrassed by it, right? I didn't want to be ashamed or feel guilty for my kind of primal reaction to this thing that I never thought would happen, even though I thought I'd piecemealed every possible thing that ever happened to me in my career through driving around and in my sleep and dreams and all these things that happen to cops. Um, but I didn't actually have that video. It was non-functional. So I remember being relieved and let down at the same time from not having that, I suppose, like that proof of what really happened.
It's funny you say that because in my last one, it was the same thing. When I found out there was video of it, I was the same thing. I was wanted to see it, and
Hmm.
then there's part of me that didn't want to see it. So yeah, it's you just hope that you did the right thing, right?
Yeah. Yeah. As a Sarge, do you find yourself either on the team or just in your other units? Do you find you sharing some insights from those critical incidents, OIS, with your people in some version or some format?
I do, and so for me, even when I make a bad decision, right? Like I want everybody else to learn from that so that they don't repeat what I just did.
Yeah.
Um, so with the inquest process, for example, right? I knew that, I didn't have to go and testify, but I went and testified. I knew I didn't have to be there for the entire week. I went for the entire week because nobody in my department had been through one yet. And so I wanted to go through the whole week and sit through it. And so that way I could come back and share that experience with my department and let them make their own decision whether they wanted to go or not. Um, Hindsight being what it is, probably poor decision to sit through it for 5 days. It was terrible.
Hmm.
But I gleaned a lot of information, took a lot of notes, and came back and presented that information to our department and each squad so that they could make their own decision going forward.
Yeah. Yeah, you demonstrate a lot of this, like throwing yourself into the fire, to make a metaphor, like what you just said. Like, yeah, like no one listening to that would be like, yeah, I want to sign up for that. I mean, there for sure will be some listeners that'd be like, yeah, that sounds like a great purpose. But I appreciate the reflection where you're like, man, that sucked, right? Probably extremely stressful, just taxing, maybe mentally, emotionally. Have you thought about what it is that makes you want to dive into the fire to help bring back that information? Because I hear it in that example, and it's also so many tried and true examples of just your day to day assignments and operations.
We have really good people, right, in every department in this state. Um, Washington State has some pretty messed up laws in terms of how we treat law enforcement.
Hmm.
But for people to want to come into this line of work at this point with how bad things are in Washington State, those are really good hearted people. And so I think that we have a duty and responsibility to them to arm them with all the information we possibly can so that they can make the educated decision when it becomes their time, right? And so I think that's your role as a leader is to be selfless. And if not me, then who, right? If I don't want to sit through the inquest process, but man, I'd sure like Eric to go and sit through that for me and tell me how it went. That to me, that's not fair. And so I always go back to if not me, then who? And so for me, I made it to Thursday in the inquest, and then Friday I was like, no, I'm done.
Hmm.
And but 4 days of it was enough for me to know what I needed to know, and then I moved on. Um, but again, the feedback I'm getting from the squads I presented it to is always been very positive. Where people are, hey, I really appreciate you going through that. I really appreciate the information you brought back. And so it's for me, it's not for nothing, right? To answer your question, man, I don't know where that drive comes from. I'm obviously very big on the team concept, and at some point, everybody has to step into the hopper and take a role in that. So again, if I have an opportunity to do that, then I'm going to do that so that other people can learn from it.
Yeah. No, I think that's really well said. When you think about all the things that you've been through, I hear a lot of adversity early on, right? To even include making some decisions that hindered your performance at Central Washington, right? But then all
Mm.
these opportunities, and really like what I see and what I like highlighting, and I've always tried to get at that through this process and this project, which is like really highlighting how you've developed resilience and grit, right? It's the name of the show, but overtly asking like, what are some things that have helped you maintain yourself and to be your best self and keep showing up in this way?
I think it's kind of twofold, man. Like I'm a forever student, so I have this really weird part of me where when I start to learn something and get proficient at it, like I get really bored with it and I move on to something else.
Yep.
And so I think that's why law enforcement has kind of piqued my interest for so long, is because it's constantly changing. And as you know, you could go to 100 domestic violence calls and every single one of them is going to be different. And that's something that's always appealed to me about law enforcement, is that it really helps with, I guess, my need to learn something new or my need to try something new. And so with law enforcement, it changes every year. There's new case law, there's new policies. And so you're constantly changing the way you do business. And so for me, it was just, I want to continue to learn. I want to continue to experience new things. And this job has really done it for me. I'm one of those weirdos that really likes patrol. Like I like the concept of being the person that shows up when somebody calls 911,
Mm-hmm.
and I want to ensure that I'm well educated and well trained and can resolve that call safely. And I think about, if a family member of mine were to call 911, what kind of police officer I'd want to show up. And I want to try to be that kind of police officer. Um, and again, I don't want to be that police officer that can't help my partner if they need help. And so the physical fitness component and being in shape and understanding the laws and procedures and being fit is all part of it for me. And so this job is very challenging and it's very rewarding. I mean, man, some of the best calls that will stick with you for the rest of your life aren't the super cool, hostage rescue or whatever. It's, you found a lost child in the middle of the night and brought him back to their family. Like those are the ones you remember. Like
Mm-hmm.
for me, I remember finding highly autistic child that was lost in the middle of the night in the winter. Found the child, brought her home. Like to me, like that one will stick with me forever. Like that's a win.
Yeah.
Because as a parent, like you could imagine losing your child in the middle of the night and not knowing where they're at, especially if they're they're disabled. And so
Yep.
like that's why we do this job. At least that's why I do this job.
Yeah. I think that's why most people do the job, or why they came in, but we lose sight of that because of the grind, because of cynicism. Like these things are normal, so it's not to like feel bad about it, but just to be aware so you can combat it. And I love how you highlighted a couple things. One is that patrol's where it's at. I think that too often I think it's maybe it's a double-edged sword with like trying to push development. But what I'm trying to have certain officers that sound like they're trying to get out of patrol, I'm like, you enjoy where you're at, but there's so much skill development that we can acquire and work on, like skill, I suppose, like specialization in patrol. That doesn't mean you're like hopping out of patrol. And everyone has their own trajectory of the things they want to do, and I'm definitely a supportive of that. But I think that we all do ourselves a disservice if we think that we can't learn like a volume of things in patrol. And that's also probably meaningful to say to some smaller departments that don't have a lot of full-time specialties. It's like you can be an absolute you can be a journeyman and do all these things, or you could be the subject matter expert in this tech or this type of process or instructorship like in your department, and you might be the guru in like 6 things if you keep having that student hat on. So that's a little shout out there. I also love that you highlighted the physical fitness aspect, not just for the job, but kind of processing how you be your best as a functional individual, and then follow that up with training, right? Because we need to know our legal bounds, and we need to be super squared away in order to help our decision making. So that's been a more prevalent subject in a lot of the recent episodes. So shout out to Tom Ovens and some trainers that are really highlighting that type of topic, so we can make sure that our people are the best equipped to handle whatever may come at them.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I know you're really into physical fitness too, but for me, it should be a mainstay, and it's unfortunate that in our line of work that there isn't more stress on that. I mean, you potentially sit sedentary for a number of hours a day in a car, right? And then you're asked to perform some physical activity, and we see it around every department, right? There's people that are severely out of shape, and is their liability to themselves and the people around them. But I think it's our job to continue to provide education to them and try to, show them the way and help them get to a better place. But it is, you take it all the way even to an OIS, right? Like how the brain processes oxygen and how you manage stress and make critical decisions under stress. And the fact of the matter is, you're more physically fit, the better you process that information.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that that's like a valid tie in to people that are more sedentary in their roles, aka like me, like command or investigations, right? Maybe you're not in the field a whole lot, so you can give yourself the excuse, but do you want to be sharp in that interview? Do you want to be able to manage this caseload and think about all your viable leads quickly, effectively? Do you want to show up for the victims in the best way you can? Well, that will require you to take a vested interest in your health. And this is not to shame. Maybe it's like a little bit of like calling out, calling up. A little bit of peer pressure can go a long way. But I think that while I am a huge fan of building wellness programs and policies and things to help, I suppose, lower the fruit, like the low hangingness of the fruit, like it's not the agency's responsibility. I think that we, as an agency and management, should be responsible for helping our people do our job, and that's one piece of it. However, it's on the individual. Like it's always been that way. That's never going to go away. I can bring in all these experts and resources, and we can fully furnish this gym. Shoot, we could do 2 gyms. We could do yoga, all these things. Are you going to do any of it? Are you going to go to open mat
Yep.
time?
Yep.
That's on you. No, I appreciate that, man. Are you still skydiving?
I don't, I gave that up. So for me, it came down to, I have a ton of hobbies. And so other hobbies took priority. And then it came down to, being proficient versus being current. And in skydiving, if you're current, doesn't mean you're proficient. And when you're not proficient, it's a good way to get hurt. So
Yeah.
I was, a little over 450 jumps, no injuries. I figured it was time. I was current, not proficient in my mind. So it was time to move on.
I love that because I'm curious about your other hobbies now, like what's next. But my thought was like, what's next? And that perpetual studentness is what made me think about skydiving and wanting to
Oh,
bring
man.
that up.
Jiu-jitsu has completely taken over my world, and it has for the
It
last
tends to do that.
almost 8 years now. And I think the thing that, again, jiu-jitsu is a lot like law enforcement in terms of that you can never master it. It's always changing and moving forward, and new things come out, new styles, new moves, whatever. And so for me, you're a constant student. If you do it for 40 years, you're still learning. If you do
Yeah.
it for a year, you're still learning. And so I've become completely obsessed with jujitsu in the last 8 years. And that is my hobby. That'll be my hobby as long as I can continue to do it physically. Um, I'm fortunate in the sense that, like, my family all does it with me. And so my
Mhm.
wife has been training with me for almost 8 years now. My daughter's been doing it for about 12, 13 years. My son's been doing it for about 10 years. And so for us, it's also family time.
Family affair.
Um,
Yeah.
yeah, but that is my complete obsession. That, and then I fly as well. And so I think once I started flying, that kind of put the skydiving on the back burner. I was kind of getting what I needed out of flying.
Yeah. Flying, not falling.
Yeah, yeah,
Get to stay in the air longer.
yeah.
Yeah, man. Like as I'd shared, man, it's been embarrassing long. Like I hopped into jujitsu and I got a lot of positive feedback, right? Like to start as, I think I was 37, 38 at the time, but, I don't think of myself as a competitive person in the lineup of cops, but I absolutely am. And so I found myself riddled with injuries trying to roll the 20-year-olds, at early morning, like 5 a.m. practice. And so I've had this naggingness to like get back in and like don't just resign. And the podcast sure takes a lot of time, and so it's hobbies and competing interests. But someone like you, so I'm going to ask you personally, like what helps you toggle that? Because you take good care of yourself, but these things don't tend to get easier as you get older. Um, what tends to help you kind of toggle that? Because you are in the field and you're on the team, you have a lot of physical obligations that are not what I contend with, but still I found myself pushing myself way too hard, and then not my whole goal was a lot of things that wasn't to advance. And so I'm almost like, if I get back into it, I have to have, I'm almost telling me this mantra, and maybe some people are going to eye roll, maybe some people will resonate, but like, to advance as slowly as possible, because I was going to 3 times a week and I felt like that wasn't enough because I wanted to learn more faster, all these things.
Same with me. And so I'm probably not the best person to ask, because when I start something, I jump, fully headfirst into the pool with it,
Mm-hmm.
and I tend to go 1,000 miles an hour. But for jujitsu specifically, like I started training jujitsu, did a little bit in the military, and then I got my daughter started in jujitsu when she was, I think, 5 or 6, and she started competing. She's very, very, very good at jujitsu. So she started competing at a very high level, and I was going to these tournaments, and as you know, it's a different language, right? And so
Mm-hmm.
I didn't understand the language, and I didn't know how to support my daughter with, hey, you did well with this, or you should have tried this. And so I felt like I needed to start training to better understand what she was doing,
Mm.
and trying to grow that connection with her in the sport that she loves. And then I fell in love with it. Again, I train 3 to 4 days a week still currently, and have for the last 7 or 8 years. For me, it's an outlet. And the unique thing about jujitsu, much like the military, it's a melting pot of people.
Yeah.
And so you get everybody from, criminals to cops. And for that hour and a half, everybody is friends. It's the same team. Everybody is wanting to help each other get better. And so it's, whether you're a day one white belt or you're a 25-year black belt, like everybody's goal is the same. It's a common goal, common team. You're working towards, improving each other. And I really liked that. It was a way that I could put my phone aside, because I'm tied to a phone with my current assignment. And
Yep.
so I could put my phone in the car for an hour and a half and have an hour and a half to myself and my family, where I'm not being bothered by emails or texts or phone calls. And so for me, it's an outlet too. I can go there when I'm having a really terrible day, and I leave there feeling a lot better.
Mm-hmm.
And so jujitsu is awesome, as you know, on multiple different levels. I don't know if you've ever read the Marietta, Georgia study for law
No.
enforcement. You should look it up. It's incredible. Just what it does in terms of use of force application, injury to suspect, injuries to officers. And Marietta, Georgia now requires that all their police officers train jujitsu regularly. And so their use of force all went down. Injury to suspect went down. Officers' morale went up. All the above, public trust, all the things you'd want, right, from a program. And so for me, I've tried to incorporate that into my current department. So we started a program, so people can come in off duty and train with one of our trainers. They get comp time for being there. They're covered under L&I if they get hurt. All the questions cops ask, right? What if I get hurt? Am I
Yeah.
covered or am I not covered? And so our chief did a really good job of kind of alleviating all those concerns with the effort and the hope of getting more people to train jujitsu, so that the department as a whole could be better.
Yeah, I love that. And in my brief stint, like double hatting recruiting and training, like that was one of my things, because I was rolling at the time, and I was like, man, we just, for years, for generations, people said we need open mat, we just need more access, because there's a lot of really great practitioners, whether they grapple or whether they do BJJ, but just like reps matter, and just a little bit goes so long away. And I just felt like even my super noob, like basically novice nothingness, like help me better explain things to our new recruits coming in to do their basic hour. Like I was able to be a dummy, and I was able to tell them like, hey, slide your knee up this way, that helps. Like, oh shit, that hurts. All these things, like a little goes so much along, so far a ways, where I can recognize that in my several months of doing it, I understood so much more about counter joints and body positioning than I did from how many, like 15 years, 16 years of law
Yeah.
enforcement on, in recognizing that what I was doing in those 15 years was more than the average, in the nation. So it says a lot,
The,
but
the thing about cops, as you know, is like cops don't like not being good at things,
yeah.
and
Yeah.
jujitsu humbles you. And so, the first day of jujitsu, I remember it very clear as day, right? Like I go in there, I'm a SWAT guy, I'm a former Ranger, yada, 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 right? Physically fit. And you're getting rolled up by, teenagers,
Yeah.
female teenagers, and like
Yeah,
it's very
like
very humbling.
110
And like
pounds. Yeah.
yeah, I remember just feeling like I don't ever want to feel like this again. And in our line of work, I mean, you could be by yourself fighting with somebody high on methamphetamines in the middle of the night for a number of minutes before somebody comes to help you. And like,
Mhm.
that's not the time to figure out that you aren't trained. Right. And so I didn't ever want to be put in a position like that again. So I made a commitment to myself that I'm going to continue to train this as long as I'm doing this job.
Yeah.
And it's, it's humbling for sure, man. It continues to humble you. And I think the better that you get at jiu-jitsu, the more it humbles you
Yeah.
because you're expected to know more. It's similar to being a supervisor, right? Like you're a sergeant, so you should know more. But again, you can learn as much from a white belt as you can from a black belt.
Absolutely. And I think that checking of the ego is important, because even when I went in, I was like, shoot, people know I'm a cop. Like pretty quick, they just,
Yeah.
it's a friendly environment, right? And I love the interaction with people that aren't all in the industry. But then I was like, man, I need to like rep all cops, and I need to like, uh,
Yep.
I can't tap. Man, don't check that real quick, right? Like,
Yeah.
because I talked
Yeah.
about, being injured, and it wasn't even so much like not tapping. It was just going at a pace that just wasn't sustainable at the rate of my lack of training and
Hmm.
trying to go full bore. But no, man, I appreciate that, and I think that that's so helpful. I think it's a conversation where we need to recognize what we're afraid of, and I think that's what hinders a lot of cops from getting back in the gym, even just the general gym, like picking up some weights. Is like they don't want to be exposed that they've been going out on the street for the last 5 years hoping something bad doesn't happen, that they
Yep.
don't have to use their physical strength or grip strength to defeat somebody's grip on their pistol. Like, it's exposing, but all the more reason why we should do it. And listeners, for sure will be in that vein where they're trying to self-develop and self-improve.
Yeah. Hope is definitely not a tactic, man.
No.
And unfortunately, a lot of cops do that. And I don't know. I think we as a whole in law enforcement are getting better for sure. I think that jiu-jitsu is becoming more, widely known that it's applicable to law enforcement. I think more cops are picking up the hobby, which is really cool to see. Um, for me, I just wish I would have started it, 18 years ago instead of 8 years ago.
Yeah. No, but fantastic. Get started today. Do what you can now. So, man, I appreciate all the lessons. We've covered a lot of ground. Is there anything you want to leave the listeners with? And um, if they can reach out, or how they would do that for you?
I guess for the cops that would listen to your show, understand that a vast majority of the public does appreciate what you do. It's the loud, small percentage of the population that make you feel like you're not wanted there or that they don't like you. I know that not to be the case. A vast majority of the public appreciates what we do and they're supportive of what we do. But it's really hard when you're constantly faced every single day with negativity. I mean, people don't call 911 when they're having a good day and they want to share it with somebody. They call you at their worst moment in their life. And so we have to be empathetic to that they're going through something and they may vent on you. It's not personal, it's professional. They're yelling at the uniform, not, me personally. And understand that at the end of the day, like the public does appreciate us and they do understand our role and support us. And then for the non-listeners, I guess or non-cops would be just to, give police officers some grace that, we see a lot of traumatic stuff every single day, day in, day out. And if we get short or we snap at you, it's not personal. It's just that we may have just left a pretty tragic scene to go deal with your neighbor dispute. And so it's very hard to see traumatic stuff over and over and over and then go to, your neighbor's fence line is 6 inches too far onto your property and you want us to resolve it. We just saw, potentially a dead child in a car accident. You can't just go from one to the other and expect the best out of everybody at every moment.
Yeah. Yeah. I appreciate that, man. Extending some grace and some patience and recognizing, to make it to drive home. One of the biggest themes of this whole conversation is like same team, right? We're all in it
Yep.
together. Like we are of the community. So I appreciate that, man. And thanks so much for coming on.
Of course, absolutely.
Thank you for tuning into another episode of Blue Grit Radio. As always, support this community by subscribing, giving us a 5-star review, and following, liking, and sharing posts on Blue Grit Wellness on Instagram. You can reach me there or email me at bluegritwellness@gmail.com. Be well and stay gritty.